The December winds of 1883 howled across the New Mexico territory with a fury that promised the harshest winter in memory, carrying ice crystals that cut like tiny knives and the scent of snow from the distant mountains. Robert Bobby McKenna pulled his worn coat tighter as he guided his mule-drawn wagon along the rutted trail that led from the mining town of Silver Creek back to his small homestead 15 miles to the south. The 28-year-old prospector had spent the last of his savings on supplies for his struggling family, hoping that the meager provisions in his wagon would see them through until spring brought new opportunities. Bobby's situation was desperate in ways that went beyond mere poverty. His wife Sarah had given birth to their third child just 2 months ago, and the difficult delivery had left her weak and unable to work. Their 2 older children, 6-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Tommy, needed warm clothes and proper food to survive the approaching winter, but Bobby's played-out mining claims had produced barely enough silver ore to buy basic necessities. The 160-acre homestead he'd claimed under the Homestead Act offered shelter, but little else. The land was too rocky for farming and too dry for reliable water sources. As Bobby's wagon creaked through a narrow canyon where wind-carved sandstone formations created natural shelters from the biting cold, his mule suddenly balked and refused to continue forward. The animal's ears were pricked forward, focused on something ahead that Bobby couldn't immediately see through the swirling snow that had begun to fall. Years of mining in dangerous country had taught Bobby to trust his mule's instincts. The animal had saved his life more than once by detecting cave-ins, gas pockets, and other hazards that human senses missed. Climbing down from the wagon seat, Bobby peered through the gathering storm and spotted what had alarmed his mule. Huddled against the base of a massive boulder perhaps 50 yards ahead, barely visible through the snow, was a human figure that appeared to be in serious distress. As Bobby approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, he could see it was an elderly Apache man, dressed in traditional clothing that provided inadequate protection against the savage cold. The old man was conscious but clearly suffering from exposure, his weathered face gray with cold and his body shaking with violent tremors that indicated the advanced stages of hypothermia. He appeared to be in his 70s, with long white hair and the dignified bearing of someone who'd lived through decades of hardship with his honor intact. More troubling still, Bobby could see evidence of injury. A crude bandage around the elder's left leg was stained with frozen blood, and his moccasins were worn through, his feet likely frostbitten from walking through snow and ice. Bobby's first instinct was caution. Apache-white relations in the territory were tense at best, with raids and reprisals creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and fear. But looking at this frail old man dying of cold and neglect, Bobby could see only a fellow human being who needed immediate help to survive. The moral calculus was simple. Whatever dangers might come from helping an Apache, they paled beside the certainty that this elder would die within hours if left alone in the storm. "Grandfather," Bobby said softly, using the respectful Apache term he'd learned from traders, "I'm going to help you. Don't be afraid." The old man's dark eyes, still sharp despite his physical distress, studied Bobby's face with obvious surprise. When he spoke, it was in halting English learned through decades of contact with white miners and settlers. "You help Apache?" he whispered through chattering teeth. "Why, your people, my people, enemies." Bobby was already lifting the elder in his arms, surprised by how light he'd become clearly. He'd been without adequate food for some time. "Because you're dying, and I can't let that happen while I have the power to prevent it." Getting the elderly Apache man into his wagon and wrapped in the warmest blankets Bobby possessed was only the first challenge in what promised to be a difficult journey home. The storm was intensifying rapidly, with snow falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere yards, and the temperature plummeting toward levels that could kill even healthy people caught without adequate shelter. Bobby's homestead lay 3 hours away under the best conditions, but these were far from the best conditions. As Bobby urged his reluctant mule forward into the blizzard, he learned fragments of the old man's story. His name was Nahuel, which meant jaguar in Apache, and he'd been a respected elder and medicine man among his people before age and infirmity had made him a burden during their desperate flight from cavalry pursuit. 3 days ago, his band had been forced to leave him behind when soldiers had gotten too close to their mountain hiding place, promising to return for him when it was safe but knowing that such a return might never be possible. "Better I die here than slow down young ones with families to protect," Nahuel explained with the stoic acceptance that marked Apache attitudes toward death and sacrifice. "Old man's life, not worth risking children's lives." Bobby felt his anger rising at the thought of soldiers pursuing elderly refugees through winter storms, but he kept his focus on the immediate challenge of getting them both home alive. The wagon wheels were beginning to slip on the increasingly icy trail, and his mule was showing signs of exhaustion that suggested they might not reach shelter before the storm overwhelmed them. "Tell me about your family," Bobby said, partly to keep Nahuel conscious and alert, but also because he genuinely wanted to understand the human cost of the conflicts that plagued the territory. "What happened to them?" Nahuel's weathered face grew soft with memory and pain as he described his grandchildren, bright, curious youngsters who'd been forced to live like hunted animals, moving constantly to avoid soldiers who seemed to view all Apache as enemies, regardless of their actual actions. His daughter had died of fever the previous winter, leaving her children in his care until the current crisis had forced impossible choices on the surviving adults. Little ones deserve better than hiding in caves, eating roots and berries when they should have warm lodges and plenty of food, Nahuel said sadly. But white man's reservation is prison that kills Apache spirit. Better to die free than live as slaves. Bobby understood that sentiment better than most. His own family's poverty was partly the result of his refusal to accept employment with mining companies that used dangerous practices and paid starvation wages. He'd chosen the uncertainty of independent prospecting over the security of wage slavery, accepting hardship as the price of maintaining his dignity and autonomy. As they struggled through the worst of the storm, Bobby found himself sharing his own story with the elderly Apache, his failed mining ventures, his wife's difficult pregnancy and slow recovery, and his children's need for warm clothes and adequate food. The conversation revealed similarities that transcended cultural differences. Both men were fathers and grandfathers trying to protect their families in a harsh world that seemed determined to crush anyone who couldn't fight back. "You have children who need you," Nahuel observed, his voice growing stronger as the wagon's blankets and Bobby's body heat began to restore his circulation. "Yet you risk your safety to help old Apache man. This shows great heart. My children need to learn that helping others is more important than protecting yourself," Bobby replied. "If I teach them to ignore suffering when they have the power to prevent it, what kind of people will they become?" The lights of Bobby's homestead appeared through the swirling snow like stars promising salvation, and Bobby felt relief flood through him as he realized they'd both survived the dangerous journey. But his challenges were just beginning. He now had to explain to his already struggling family why he'd brought home an elderly Apache man who would need food, warmth, and medical care they could barely afford to provide. The reunion at Bobby's modest log cabin was both heartwarming and complicated as his family tried to process the unexpected arrival of an Apache elder who clearly needed immediate medical attention. Sarah McKenna, still weak from childbirth but possessing the natural compassion that had drawn Bobby to her in the first place, took one look at Nahuel's condition and immediately began preparing warm broth and gathering supplies for treating his injuries. "Robert McKenna, you can't keep bringing home strays like they're lost puppies," Sarah said with mock sternness that couldn't hide her approval of her husband's actions. First it was that injured coyote, then the prospector with the broken leg, now an Apache grandfather. What's next? 6-year-old Emma peered at Nahuel with the fearless curiosity of childhood, studying his traditional clothing and weathered features with obvious fascination. "Is he a real Indian, Papa? Like in the stories?" "He's a real person who needed help," Bobby replied gently, helping Nahuel settle into a chair near their wood stove. "His name is Nahuel, and he's going to stay with us until he's strong enough to travel safely." 4-year-old Tommy hung back shyly at first, but gradually drew closer as Nahuel began speaking to the children in a mixture of Apache and English, sharing simple stories about animals and nature that transcended language barriers. The old man's gentle demeanor and obvious affection for children quickly won over even the most suspicious family members. As Sarah tended Nahuel's injuries, cleaning and properly bandaging his wounded leg, treating his frostbitten feet, and feeding him small portions of nourishing food that wouldn't overwhelm his empty stomach, the true extent of his ordeal became clear. He'd been walking for 3 days through country that challenged experienced frontiersmen, surviving on snow and what little plant matter he could find, driven by the simple determination to find shelter before the storm killed him. "You saved my life," Nahuel told Bobby, as the warmth and food began to restore his strength. "Among my people, this creates bond that cannot be broken. I am now part of your family. You are part of mine." Bobby felt moved by the formal declaration, but also concerned about its practical implications. "Nahuel, I appreciate the sentiment, but you don't owe me anything. Any decent person would have done the same thing. The old man shook his head with the patient authority of someone who'd lived long enough to understand fundamental truths about human nature. Not any person would risk safety of family to help Apache elder. You chose kindness over fear, generosity over self-protection. Such choices have consequences that go far beyond what you can see. Over the next several days, as the blizzard raged outside and Nahuel slowly recovered his strength, the McKenna household adjusted to accommodate their unexpected guest. The children were fascinated by his stories of Apache life and his knowledge of desert survival, while Sarah appreciated his gentle help with household tasks despite his injuries. Most surprisingly, Bobby discovered that Nahuel possessed extensive knowledge of mineral formations and mining techniques that could prove invaluable to a struggling prospector. These mountains hold much silver and copper, Nahuel explained as he studied Bobby's crude maps of local mining claims. But white men dig in wrong places, look for obvious signs instead of understanding how Earth speaks to those who listen. The old man's insights into geological formations, water sources, and the subtle indicators that marked valuable mineral deposits opened Bobby's eyes to possibilities he'd never considered. Traditional Apache knowledge of the land, accumulated over generations of intimate contact with every rock and stream, provided perspectives that formal mining education couldn't match. You could make me rich if you wanted to, Bobby observed one evening as they planned reconnaissance trips to promising locations once the weather improved. Rich in money, maybe, Nahuel replied with a smile. But you already rich in things that matter, more family who love you, children who trust you, wife who believe in your goodness. These treasures worth more than all silver in these mountains. As the storm finally broke and clear skies returned to the mountain country, Bobby found himself facing a decision that would affect his family's future in ways he was only beginning to understand. Nahuel's recovery had progressed remarkably well, and the old man was clearly capable of traveling again, but their conversations about mining possibilities had opened up opportunities that could transform the McKennas' desperate financial situation. More importantly, Bobby had grown genuinely fond of the Apache elder who'd brought wisdom, dignity, and unexpected humor into their isolated household. Nahuel had proven to be a natural teacher, sharing practical knowledge about weather prediction, plant identification, and resource conservation that made their subsistence lifestyle more efficient and sustainable. The children adored him, hanging on his every word as he described Apache customs and natural history with the patient skill of someone who'd spent decades passing knowledge to younger generations. Sarah had initially been skeptical about housing an Apache in their vulnerable homestead, but Nahuel's gentle nature and obvious affection for her children had won her over completely. He's been a blessing, not a burden, she confided to Bobby one morning, as they watched the old man teach Emma and Tommy how to identify edible plants. The children are learning more from him than they ever learned from those school books we can't afford. The peaceful routine was interrupted on the 5th day after the storm, when riders appeared on the ridge overlooking Bobby's property. Through his field glasses, Bobby could count at least 10 Apache warriors moving with the disciplined precision of a military patrol. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but Nahuel's excited reaction suggested these weren't hostile visitors. "My grandson," Nahuel exclaimed, pointing toward the lead rider. "Ayana's boy, all grown into fine warrior. They come looking for old grandfather who was supposed to die in storm." The reunion that followed was emotional and complex, filled with joy at finding their elder alive but also amazement at the circumstances of his rescue. The young war leader, who introduced himself as Cochise in honor of the famous chief, studied Bobby with intelligent eyes that missed nothing as he tried to understand why a white family would risk their safety to protect an Apache elder. "Grandfather tells us you saved his life when he was dying of cold and hunger," Cochise said in careful English, his bearing formal but not hostile. "This creates obligations between our families that must be properly acknowledged." Bobby stepped forward with as much dignity as he could muster, acutely aware that he was outnumbered by some of the most skilled fighters in the Southwest. "I did what anyone should do when they find another human being in distress. Your grandfather is a good man who's been a welcome guest in my home." Cochise studied Bobby's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Few white men would say such words about Apache elder. Fewer still would risk their family's safety to prove their sincerity. "Grandfather speaks truly, you are man of honor." What followed was a ceremony that Bobby didn't fully understand, but clearly recognized as significant. Nahuel spoke at length in Apache, gesturing toward Bobby and his family while the warriors listened with obvious respect. When the old man finished, Cochise stepped forward with a formal announcement that would change everything for the struggling McKenna family. "Robert McKenna," the war leader declared, "you have proven yourself worthy of Apache respect by saving our elder when he had nowhere else to turn. This debt can only be repaid through actions that demonstrate the depth of our gratitude." The gifts that the warriors presented were both practical and valuable. A string of 8 magnificent horses that represented enormous wealth on the frontier, supplies of jerked meat and other preserved foods that would sustain the family through the remaining winter months, and beautifully crafted tools and weapons that bore the distinctive artistry of Apache craftsmen. "We cannot give you back the time and resources you spent caring for our grandfather," Cochise explained as Bobby stared at the assembled wealth in amazement. "But we can ensure that your kindness brings rewards worthy of the risk you took." The immediate impact of the Apache gifts was transformative for the McKenna family's prospects and daily living conditions. 8 prime horses represented more wealth than Bobby had accumulated in years of struggling mining ventures, while the preserved food supplies eliminated the constant worry about whether they'd have enough to eat until spring crops could be planted. More importantly, the beautifully crafted tools and weapons would improve their efficiency and security in ways that money couldn't buy. But the deeper significance of the exchange went far beyond material considerations. Word of the unusual arrangement between Bobby McKenna and the Apache spread rapidly through the scattered mining and ranching communities around Silver Creek, creating reactions that ranged from admiration to suspicion. Some neighbors viewed Bobby's actions as evidence of dangerous sympathy for hostile Indians, while others recognized the practical benefits of peaceful relations with people who possessed intimate knowledge of the local terrain and resources. Sarah initially worried about the attention their situation was attracting, especially when territorial officials began asking questions about Apache activity in the area. "Bobby, people are starting to talk," she said one evening as they counted their unexpected blessings. "Some folks think we're in league with hostiles. Let them think what they want," Bobby replied, watching Nahuel teach their children how to weave baskets from native grasses. "I know the difference between right and wrong, and helping a dying old man was right regardless of his ancestry." The first real test of their new relationship came when Bobby decided to explore the mining possibilities that Nahuel had described. The old Apache's knowledge of geological formations led them to a hidden canyon, where silver veins ran through easily accessible rock faces deposits that could be worked by a small family operation, without the expensive equipment that corporate mining required. "This place has been sacred to our people for generations," Nahuel explained as they examined the promising rock formations. "But silver means nothing to Apache. We never understood why white men kill each other for shiny metal. Better that metal help good family than lie unused in earth." The mining operation that Bobby established with Nahuel's guidance proved modestly but consistently profitable, producing enough high-grade ore to provide steady income while requiring minimal investment in equipment or labor. More importantly, the location was defensible and easily concealed, allowing them to work without attracting unwanted attention from either claim jumpers or territorial authorities who might question their Apache connections. As spring arrived and travel became easier, Cochise and his warriors began making regular visits to check on their elder and maintain their relationship with the McKenna family. These visits evolved into a system of mutual support that benefited everyone involved. The Apache provided security and local knowledge, while Bobby shared information about territorial political developments and military movements that could affect their safety. The arrangement faced its first serious challenge when a cavalry patrol led by Captain William Hayes arrived at Bobby's homestead with questions about reported Apache activity in the area. Hayes was a career officer with strong opinions about Indian policy and little patience for civilians who complicated his mission through unauthorized contact with hostile tribes. "Mr. McKenna," Hayes announced without dismounting, "we've had reports of Apache warriors visiting your property. As a territorial citizen, you're obligated to report such contacts to military authorities." Bobby stepped onto his porch, positioning himself between the soldiers and his house where Nahuel waited inside with Sarah and the children. "Captain, I haven't seen any hostile Apache in this area. Just an old man who needed medical attention during the blizzard." "An old man?" Hayes repeated skeptically. "Sir, we're talking about armed warriors, not refugees seeking charity." It was then that Nahuel himself appeared in the doorway, moving with the dignity that commanded respect even from enemies. The old Apache studied Captain Hayes with intelligent eyes that reflected decades of dealing with military officers, some honorable and some not. "I am the Apache you seek," Nahuel announced calmly. Old man who was dying until this good family saved my life. If you have questions about my presence here, ask me directly. The confrontation on Bobby's porch stretched for several tense minutes as Captain Hayes tried to assess a situation that didn't fit his understanding of Apache-white relations. Military regulations were clear about unauthorized contact with hostile Indians, but the reality before him was more complex than regulations anticipated. An elderly Apache man who was clearly a guest rather than a threat, living peacefully with a white family who seemed genuinely fond of him. Sir, Hayes addressed Nahuel with stiff formality. You're supposed to be on the reservation with the rest of your people. What are you doing on this homestead? Nahuel's response carried the patient dignity of someone who'd spent decades explaining Apache perspectives to white officials who rarely bothered to listen. I am here because this man saved my life when I was dying in storm. Among my people, such debt creates bonds that cannot be broken by government regulations. Bobby sensed the dangerous undercurrents in the conversation and stepped forward to support his guest. Captain, this man was near death when I found him. Helping him was a matter of basic human decency, not politics. Mr. McKenna, your humanitarian impulses are commendable, but they don't override federal Indian policy, Hayes replied curtly. All Apache individuals must be registered and supervised through proper channels. The standoff might have escalated if not for the timely arrival of Sheriff Tom Crawford from Silver Creek. Crawford was a practical man who'd learned that survival in frontier law enforcement required flexibility and common sense, rather than rigid adherence to regulations that often ignored local realities. Captain Hayes, Crawford said as he dismounted and approached the group, I've been tracking reports of Apache activity in this area for weeks. If Mr. McKenna says he's harboring a refugee rather than hosting war parties, I'm inclined to believe him. Hayes turned toward the sheriff with obvious frustration. Sheriff, we have standing orders to investigate all reports of unauthorized Indian presence. I can't ignore military directives based on one civilian's word. Then don't ignore them, Crawford replied reasonably. Investigate thoroughly. Talk to the neighbors. Examine the evidence. Make your own assessment of whether this old man represents a threat to territorial security. The investigation that followed revealed the extent to which Bobby's actions had influenced his community's attitudes toward Apache people. Neighbors who'd initially been suspicious gradually acknowledged that Nahuel's presence had brought only positive changes to the area. His knowledge of weather patterns had helped farmers plan their planting, his understanding of water sources had guided ranchers to reliable wells, and his gentle nature had challenged stereotypes about Apache savagery that many had accepted without question. I'll admit I was worried when Bobby first brought that Indian home, confessed Martha Wilson, whose farm bordered the McKenna homestead. But that old man taught my children more about plants and animals in one afternoon than they learned in a year of school. He's been nothing but helpful and polite. Captain Hayes found himself in the politically uncomfortable position of trying to enforce regulations that local civilians viewed as unnecessarily harsh and counterproductive. His superiors wanted results that demonstrated effective Indian policy, but the reality he encountered suggested that Bobby's informal arrangement was achieving better outcomes than official programs. The compromise that emerged satisfied no one completely but allowed everyone to save face. Nahuel would be officially registered as a cultural liaison working with territorial authorities to improve Apache-white relations, giving his presence legal status while acknowledging the practical benefits of his knowledge and experience. Bobby would serve as his official sponsor, accepting responsibility for ensuring that their arrangement didn't create security problems for the broader community. This is highly irregular, Hayes grumbled as he signed the necessary paperwork, but I suppose irregular solutions are sometimes required for irregular problems. Nahuel accepted the bureaucratic designation with Apache pragmatism, understanding that white officials needed formal categories to justify decisions that common sense should have made obvious. Paper changes nothing, he told Bobby privately. You saved dying old man. Old man helps family that showed kindness. Government papers just make white men feel better about things they don't control. The formalization of Nahuel's status as a cultural liaison opened unexpected opportunities for the McKenna family and the broader community around Silver Creek. The old Apache's official position allowed him to serve as an intermediary between territorial authorities and Apache bands who'd been operating on the margins of federal oversight, creating dialogue that prevented misunderstandings from escalating into violent confrontations. Bobby found himself increasingly involved in these diplomatic efforts. His reputation as a man who'd risked his family's safety to protect an Apache elder giving him credibility with leaders on both sides of the cultural divide. His modest homestead became an unofficial meeting ground, where Apache chiefs and territorial officials could discuss policies affecting thousands of people, while his mining operation provided the financial stability that allowed him to devote time to these broader responsibilities. Sarah had initially worried that their involvement in Apache affairs would bring danger to their children, but the reality proved quite different. Emma and Tommy were thriving under Nahuel's patient tutelage, learning skills and perspectives that formal education couldn't provide. More importantly, they were growing up with an understanding of cultural diversity and human dignity that would serve them well in their future lives. The children see grandfather Nahuel as family now. Sarah observed one evening as they watched the old man teach Emma how to identify medicinal plants. They don't understand why some people think Apache are different from anyone else. Maybe that's the most important lesson they could learn, Bobby replied. That people are people, regardless of what tribe they were born into. The mining operation continued to prosper under Nahuel's guidance, producing enough consistent income to lift the McKenna family out of poverty, while providing employment for several neighbors who'd initially been skeptical of Apache involvement. The old man's knowledge of local geology had proven more valuable than any formal mining education, leading to discoveries that experienced prospectors had missed despite years of searching. But the real wealth flowing from their partnership wasn't measured in silver ore or territorial recognition. It was found in the network of relationships and mutual obligations that had developed around their initial act of simple and human kindness. Apache bands traveling through the area knew they could find sanctuary and fair treatment at the McKenna homestead, while white settlers discovered that peaceful contact with Apache could bring practical benefits that exceeded their initial fears. The arrangement faced its greatest test in the autumn of 1884 when reports reached Silver Creek of Apache raids against isolated ranches in neighboring counties. Territorial authorities immediately suspected that local Apache, including those associated with Bobby's cultural liaison program, might be involved in the hostile activities. Captain Hayes returned with a larger force and explicit orders to investigate any Apache connections that might threaten regional security. Mr. McKenna, Hayes announced during his second official visit, I'm here to suspend your cultural liaison arrangement pending investigation of recent hostile activities. All Apache individuals in this area must report to military custody immediately. Bobby felt his heart sink as he realized that their peaceful experiment was about to be destroyed by events beyond their control. Captain, Nahuel and his people have been living peacefully here for almost a year. They've done nothing but help their neighbors and improve relations between our communities. That may be true, but I have orders to investigate all Apache connections, Hayes replied with obvious reluctance. Recent raids have killed innocent families, and my superiors want accountability. It was then that Cochise himself arrived with a proposal that would demonstrate the Apache's commitment to justice and their respect for the McKenna family who'd provided sanctuary for their elder. The young war leader brought with him evidence that the raids had been conducted by a renegade band operating without tribal approval, along with an offer to track down the actual perpetrators and deliver them to territorial authorities. White man's justice and Apache justice seek same thing, punishment for those who harm innocent people, Cochise explained to the assembled officials. Give us chance to prove our words with actions. The joint expedition that followed represented unprecedented cooperation between Apache warriors and territorial law enforcement, with Cochise's band providing tracking expertise while Captain Hayes supplied official authority and military support. Bobby served as liaison between the two groups, his unique position allowing him to translate not just languages but cultural concepts that could easily lead to misunderstandings. The pursuit of the renegade Apache band led through some of the most rugged country in the territory, testing the skills and endurance of all participants while demonstrating the value of combining Apache knowledge of the land with military organization and equipment. Cochise's warriors proved invaluable in reading sign and predicting the movements of their quarry, while Hayes's soldiers provided the firepower and legal authority necessary for capturing dangerous criminals. The operation culminated in a perfectly executed ambush that netted the entire renegade band, without casualties among the pursuing forces. The raiders, led by a bitter young warrior named Black Wolf who'd rejected all attempts at peaceful coexistence with white settlers, found themselves trapped in a canyon with no escape routes available. Your raids end here, Cochise announced to the captured renegades in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of traditional justice. You have dishonored our people and brought suffering to innocent families. Now you face consequences of your choices. Captain Hayes was impressed despite himself by the efficiency and professionalism of the Apache warriors who'd helped capture the raiders. Mr. Cochise, I owe you an apology for doubting your people's commitment to peace. This operation couldn't have succeeded without your assistance. The successful resolution of the raiding crisis transformed territorial attitudes toward Apache cooperation and established the McKenna homestead as a model for peaceful coexistence that attracted visitors from throughout the Southwest. Federal officials who'd initially been skeptical of informal arrangements began to see practical benefits that formal reservation policies couldn't match. More importantly for the McKenna family, their role in facilitating the successful pursuit had earned them recognition and respect throughout the territory. Bobby's mining operation expanded as investors recognized the stability that Apache cooperation brought to the region, while Sarah found herself consulted by territorial officials seeking to understand how peaceful relations between cultures could be maintained and expanded. Nahuel, now recognized as an elder statesman whose wisdom had helped prevent a wider conflict, continued to live with the McKenna family while serving as an official advisor to territorial authorities on Apache affairs. His presence had become so integral to their household that Emma and Tommy couldn't imagine life without their Apache grandfather's patient guidance and storytelling. You gave me new life when I was dying in storm, Nahuel told Bobby one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. But more than that, you gave our peoples chance to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. The prosperity that flowed from their partnership allowed Bobby to expand his mining operations while maintaining the family atmosphere that had made their homestead a sanctuary for people of all backgrounds. Apache visitors knew they could find fair treatment and honest dealing, while white settlers discovered that peaceful contact with former enemies could bring practical benefits that exceeded their initial fears. As 1,885 dawned with promise of continued growth and stability, the McKenna family reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that snowy December day when Bobby had found a dying Apache elder by the roadside. What had begun as a simple act of human compassion had evolved into a network of relationships and obligations that benefited entire communities. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you'd just driven past that day, Sarah mused one morning as they watched Apache and white children play together in their yard. I try not to think about it, Bobby replied, shuddering at the thought of the opportunities lost and suffering ignored if he'd chosen fear over compassion. Some things are too terrible to contemplate. The success of the McKenna homestead as a center for Apache white cooperation attracted attention from unexpected quarters, including federal policymakers in Washington who were struggling with the costs and failures of traditional reservation systems. A delegation of officials arrived in the spring of 1885 to study the informal arrangements that had brought peace and prosperity to a region once plagued by conflict and mistrust. Mr. McKenna, announced Bureau of Indian Affairs Representative Harrison Cope, we're here to evaluate your cultural liaison program as a potential model for broader implementation throughout the Southwest Territories. Bobby found himself thrust into a role he'd never sought, spokesperson for an approach to Indian relations that prioritized human dignity and mutual benefit over bureaucratic control and cultural suppression. His testimony to the federal investigators was simple and direct. Treat Apache as people rather than problems, respect their knowledge and contributions, and trust in the fundamental human capacity for cooperation when mutual interests are recognized. The secret isn't complicated, Bobby explained to the assembled officials. Nahuel and his people have skills and knowledge that benefit our entire community. We have resources and legal protections that help them live safely and with dignity. When people focus on what they can do for each other instead of what they fear from each other, cooperation becomes natural. Nahuel's own testimony was equally compelling, delivered with the quiet dignity that had impressed everyone who'd encountered him. White man saved my life when I was dying, gave me place in his family when I had nowhere else to go. This created bonds stronger than government papers, deeper than tribal differences. Honor recognizes honor, regardless of skin color or customs. The federal investigation resulted in official recognition of the McKenna model as a successful alternative to reservation policies that had often failed to achieve their stated goals of assimilation and pacification. While the program wouldn't be implemented on a massive scale, bureaucratic inertia and political opposition prevented that it did provide official sanction for similar arrangements in other areas where local conditions favored cooperation over conflict. The recognition brought both opportunities and challenges for Bobby and his family. Visitors seeking to understand their methods arrived regularly, creating additional responsibilities and sometimes disrupting the quiet family life they valued. More problematically, success had attracted the attention of business interests who saw profit opportunities in their Apache connections and territorial officials who wanted to control rather than simply support their activities. Success brings its own problems. Nahuel observed one evening as they discussed offers from mining companies seeking to exploit Apache geological knowledge on a commercial scale. When white men see profit, they often forget the honor that made profit possible. Bobby had indeed received numerous offers to expand his operations or sell his knowledge of Apache-identified mineral deposits, but he'd rejected them all in favor of maintaining the personal relationships and community focus that had made their arrangement successful. Money isn't the point, he explained to disappointed investors. Community is the point. Respect is the point. The moment we turn this into just another business venture, we lose everything that makes it worthwhile. The wisdom of that approach became evident in the autumn when territorial economic conditions worsened due to drought and falling mineral prices. Many commercial mining operations failed during the downturn, but Bobby's modest family enterprise continued to prosper because it was based on sustainable practices and community support, rather than maximum extraction and profit. Apache bands throughout the region had begun adopting similar arrangements with sympathetic white families, creating a network of mutual support that provided security and stability for everyone involved. These informal partnerships proved more resilient than formal government programs because they were based on personal relationships and shared interests rather than bureaucratic mandates. We've started something bigger than any of us imagined, Sarah reflected as they watched Apache and white families gather for the harvest celebration that had become an annual tradition at their homestead. This isn't just about our family anymore, it's about proving that people can live together peacefully when they choose to see each other's humanity. As the 1,880 seconds drew to a close, the McKenna homestead had become more than a successful mining operation or an experiment in cross-cultural cooperation. It had evolved into a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, when mutual respect replaced mutual suspicion, and when individual acts of kindness created ripples that spread far beyond their original intent. Nahuel, now in his 80s but still sharp and active, had become a revered figure whose wisdom was sought by people of all backgrounds throughout the territory. His presence at the McKenna homestead provided continuity and credibility that allowed their cooperative arrangements to weather political changes and economic challenges that might have destroyed more formal programs. "Grandfather," Emma asked one evening as the old Apache helped her with a weaving project, "do you ever miss living with your own people instead of with us?" Nahuel's weathered face creased in a gentle smile as he considered the question. "Child, family is not just blood. Family is love, respect, shared struggles, and mutual care. Your father saved my life when I was dying. Your mother welcomed me into her home. You and your brother treat me as true grandfather. How could I not consider myself blessed to be part of such family?" The children who'd grown up in this multicultural environment, both Apache and white youngsters, who played together, learned from each other, and formed friendships that transcended racial boundaries, represented the future that Bobby and Nahuel had inadvertently helped create. These young people possessed skills and perspectives that neither culture could have provided alone, making them natural bridge builders who would carry forward the lessons of cooperation and mutual respect. Tommy, now approaching his teens, had become fluent in Apache and served as an unofficial translator during community meetings. His easy movement between cultures and natural diplomatic skills marked him as a potential leader who could help expand the cooperative model to other regions. Emma had developed an almost mystical understanding of desert ecology under Nahuel's patient tutelage, knowledge that would prove invaluable as the territory developed its agricultural and mining resources. The prosperity that had begun with Nahuel's geological insights had allowed Bobby to purchase additional land and expand his operations, but always with an eye toward sustainability and community benefit rather than maximum profit. His mines employed both Apache and white workers on equal terms. His trading post served customers regardless of their ancestry, and his homestead remained open to anyone seeking fair treatment and honest dealing. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was found in the attitudes of neighboring communities, where the success of the McKenna model had inspired similar experiments in cooperation and mutual respect. Families throughout the region had begun hosting Apache elders, learning traditional skills, and developing trading relationships that benefited everyone involved. "You know," Bobby told Sarah one evening, as they watched a group of children Apache and white together playing elaborate games that combined elements from both cultures. When I found Nahuel dying in that snowstorm, I thought I was just saving one old man's life. I never imagined it would change so many other lives. The best actions are often the ones we don't plan, Sarah replied, her hand resting on her growing belly where their fourth child was developing. You did what your heart told you was right, and everything good that followed grew from that simple choice. The network of cooperation and mutual support continued to expand as news of their success spread throughout the Southwest and beyond. Visitors arrived from distant territories and even foreign countries, seeking to understand how former enemies had learned to live and work together so successfully. Many left inspired to attempt similar arrangements in their own communities, carrying seeds of hope to places where conflict had seemed permanent and inevitable. Nahuel lived to see his great-grandchildren playing with McKenna grandchildren in the same yard where he'd once taught Emma and Tommy to identify edible plants and read weather signs. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 92, his funeral became a celebration that brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his wisdom and kindness. He saved us all, Cochise said during the ceremony, now an elderly chief himself but still carrying the dignity and strength that had made him a natural leader. Not just by sharing his knowledge or teaching our children, but by proving that enemies could become family when they chose to honor each other's humanity. Bobby, now gray-haired and weathered by decades of desert life but still strong and purposeful, placed the traditional Apache burial offerings beside his friend's grave, while Apache and white mourners sang songs of farewell in both languages. The old medicine man's legacy lived on in the children he'd taught, the communities he'd helped bridge, and the enduring proof that individual acts of compassion could transform entire societies. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the American Southwest from a region torn by racial conflict into a functioning multicultural society, they often cited the McKenna homestead as a turning point that demonstrated the possibility of peaceful coexistence. But for those who'd lived through the transformation, the most important legacy wasn't political or historical. It was personal. The story lived on in family traditions that honored both Apache and white customs, in business partnerships that valued cultural diversity as a source of strength, and in the simple recognition that every person deserved dignity and respect regardless of their ancestry. In a harsh land that had known too much violence and too little mercy, one cowboy's refusal to ignore a dying stranger had created ripples of hope that would flow forward through generations. The horses and food that Cochise had given to honor the debt created by Bobby's kindness had been just the beginning. Symbols of a transformation that proved the greatest treasures weren't found in mines or acquired through conquest, but discovered in the simple act of choosing compassion over indifference, understanding over fear, and love over hatred. In the end, that may have been the most valuable lesson of all, that the courage to help a stranger in distress could change not just individual lives, but the entire course of history.